The next type of navigation we're going to discuss is GPS, Global Positioning System. That's pretty common this day and age. We have it on our cell phone, we have it in our automobiles, and we also have it in the aircraft, most aircraft. But there's many varieties. Many manufacturers make different GPSs. Today we're going to discuss the highlights or the main points of the GPSs that they all have in common. So you would be able to just hop in a plane and find the main basic functions and be able to use that. Now, when we're talking about the GPSs in your airplane, we want to know or understand how this works. Just to simplify it, there's at least 24 satellites that have to be in operation at all times. And no matter where you are on Earth, so let's say we're flying right here, no matter where we are on Earth, we should be able to receive at least 5 satellites from our position. You can receive more than that, but it has to be at least 5 for the GPS to work properly. 4 are required to create a 3D picture. So keep those numbers in mind, because often your examiner will ask you on the check ride how many satellites. You tell them 24. How many are in view at all times? Should be 5 available. 4 are required for a 3D picture. Okay. Now, when we use our GPSs, we need to make sure that they are current and that they've passed their own self-test. So as far as currency, the GPSs update every 28 days, another good test question by your examiner. And how they update, it's a variety. Some you just insert a little card, some you can hook a cord in a laptop up to, but just keep in mind they do have to be updated every 28 days by some method. Now, when it's going through its self-test, at some point it's going to say that the needle is half up and half left. So you should look at your VOR indicator and make sure that that agrees with it. It should be half up and half left. It's also going to search satellites, and it'll usually see it's acquiring satellites, and then when it gets to at least 5, it's happy, and then it starts functioning for your use. Now, so just to look at a couple of the highlights, this is would be an example of a KLN 94B. It's a little older style. And then we have a Garmin 430. There's also a Garmin 530. The screen's a bit bigger, but basically functions the same. And then now we also have the new touchscreen GPSs. This would be an example of a Garmin 650. So when we're using the GPSs, no matter what style we have, they're all going to have a couple things in common. For example, the Direct To key. That's probably the most used. It's probably almost worn out on the GPS in the airplane you're learning to fly in, because we can simply push the Direct To key and then type in where we want to go. So to type it in, you usually are going to use the selector knobs. And the large knob is almost always used to move the cursor. So whatever's blinking, the large knob moves the cursor. The small knob usually makes your selection. So let's say we wanted to go to Greenville. So to type into Greenville, there's as many dashes as we may need to type something in, but it's only going to use whatever I insert in here. So if I wanted to go to Greenville, then I would put K, G, M, U, and then these will disappear. So why did I put the K? The K represents an airport. If I were going to go to Greenwood, for example, there is a Greenwood VOR, GRD. There's also a Greenwood Airport, KGRD. So putting the K in front of the airport is going to distinguish that you want the airport, not the VOR. That doesn't mean that every airport has a VOR, but if it does, it's a way to distinguish or a way for the unit to determine that you want to go to the airport and not the VOR. Now the K is understood for the US airports. If you're going to Alaska, they use P's, and if you're going to Canada, they use C's, and so on and so on. So I put a K in first by turning the small knob. We'll backtrack here for a minute. So this is going to be blinking, and I dial with a small knob a K, and then when I find the letter that I want, I'm ready to move the cursor. I use the large knob to move the cursor over, and now this one's blinking. So I can insert a G. So I use the little knob to dial in a G, and then I use the big knob to make this blink, moving the cursor. I dial in my M, and then I use the big knob to move the cursor again. This one's blinking, and the small knob to put in my U. Okay, and then I would hit enter. And usually they're going to say, this one would say Greenville, downtown Greenville, South Carolina. It's asking you, is this the one that you mean to use? Why, yes, it is the one I mean to use. So then I would simply hit enter again, because for all I know, there could be another GMU in South America. So the GPS is just prompting you to be sure that you've made the correct selection. All right, so that's how the Direct To button works. And whether you're looking at the Garmin, there's a Direct To key right here. It works the same. And if we're using a different style of Garmin, there's going to be a Direct To on this one also, which is right here. Okay, another key that we all use almost on a daily basis might be the nearest button. So the nearest button, when I press that, it's going to bring up the nearest airport, the nearest VOR, the nearest NDB station. It just depends on what fix I want to fly to. So I can select nearest and then scroll through, and moving the cursor again, I would use the large knob. It always moves my cursor around, and then I can hit enter to select what I wanted. Now another thing to note is you have some quick keys. So they call these quick keys. They're like usually a bit bigger, maybe protruding off of the GPS unit, and you can push those. But we also have some more selections that are kind of almost embedded in here. So it doesn't matter if I use a quick key or I use something in here. I like to call them books. So right now I'm on a nav book, and each book has several pages within that. So it's very easy to get lost in the GPS, pushing buttons and turning knobs, but if you understand like the overall idea behind them, it doesn't matter which one I'm using, it's going to have the same thought process behind it. So let's say that I wanted to move my cursor, because I see nav is highlighted right now, and maybe I want to move the cursor over to airport. Well, what knob moves the cursor is the big knob. So if I scroll this big knob, I'm going to see this box move through my selections, and then I would be on the airport page. And then the airport pages, or I'm sorry, book, I'll be in the airport book, and then it's going to have several pages in there. So how do you think we're going to select the different page? We're going to use the small knob to select different pages. So I might have airport page 1, page 2, page 3, and so on, and each page is going to display different information. It might be the frequencies, it might be the lat long position of the airport, and so on. The other thing that most all these GPS have in common is they have some sort of map where you can actually see, this one's on the map page right now. If I were to find the map page in this one, I would scroll over to nav, and then I would move the small knob to dial to, I believe it's nav page 4, and then I would see a color screen up here with a line going to the airport I've selected, as well as seeing my little airplane fly on that magenta line. Now, I want to warn you, this is very easy. I like to say it's idiot proof, because almost anybody can fly the little airplane on the line, okay? But this is not what you stare at when you fly the airplane. This is a tool to be used to help your situational awareness, but you should never be dependent on this, because who knows what day your unit's going to fail, or there's a GPS signal interference or a satellite interference or something like that. So please don't be tempted to always fly by staring at this picture. You're supposed to be looking at your six-pack, as well as, of course, outside the window scanning for traffic. It's okay if you have this on the map view for your quick reference to where you are, but again, I can't stress enough, please don't be reliant on that, because I guarantee if your instructor or your examiner sees that you're relying on this to know where you are, or where, you know, what your position is, they're going to take it away from you. So please don't be relying on it. Okay, but anyhow, how it works is wherever you have selected to fly to, the magenta always shows the current leg that you're flying, and it's always giving you to. Where am I going to? So in this situation, perhaps I'm flying from our airport over to Anderson. So you can see the magenta line and then the little airplane on the line. Up here, I don't have it on the map, but I see still a magenta arrow pointing toward GMU, Golf Mike Uniform, so that would indicate that we're flying back to our airport. Another key that we want to talk about would be the flight plan key. And what the flight plan key allows you to do is create an elaborate flight plan. If we want to just go from point A to point B, most people will use the direct key because you could just insert your destination and away you go. But if you want to make several stops, or maybe you want to fly to this VOR and then this VOR and then direct or something like that, then you want to maybe make a flight plan. So for the flight plan, you have to have a starting point, so let's say KGMU, and maybe we want to fly over to Pickens, so we'll say KLQK, and then we'll go to Anderson, KAND. So when we use the flight plan key, we'll insert the letters by using the big knob to move the cursor and the little knob to make our selection, and then hit enter. Typically you have to hit enter twice because it's going to ask you, do you really mean this particular airport? Yes, I mean that. And then so hit enter the second time and then create your sequence like this. So how will this look on our screen? Whether we have it on this type of screen, then it's going to go direct to Pickens first. So you'd see KLQK. And if you're on the moving map, then it would have the magenta to your first point, and then it would be black to your second point. That way you always know which one is the active leg. And then on the moving map, you're going to see your airplane flying along the way. Now, another thing that you're going to notice on the screens, no matter which screen you're on, is you'll have other things such as your distance to your destination. So in this example here, we're 23 miles to get to Pickens. On this screen here, maybe it says 4.2 miles to get to Pickens Airport right here. The other thing you will see is there's going to be a direct track or a desired track, DTK, and then what you're actually tracking, TK. So what does this mean? Well, if your desired track to Pickens is a, say, 270, but you're actually tracking a 280, then most likely you're not going to stay on your course very long. And again, we're not going to stare at our picture. What we really want to be looking at would be your VOR indicator, and you still have the needle moving left and right. So right now you're exactly on your track, but you're starting to get off course because now you're tracking this direction. So what will happen is you're going to see the needle start to move to the left because you are represented by the center and the needle represents the course or your desired track that you want to be on. So you still need to turn the airplane. Perhaps you choose a heading in this direction, 260, to fly back toward your track. Now, once you have the needle recentered, you want to keep your direct track and your current track the same because that's going to keep you on course. Now, what heading you're flying in order to keep that, it depends on the wind. If there was no wind at all, then your desired track might be 270. You could be tracking 270. You're also flying a heading of 270. But it's not very often that the winds are calm when we fly. So let's say, for example, we have the winds. We'll just go ahead and make it out of the southeast like this. So the winds are blowing you off course. So originally, your desired track was 270. That's from point A to point B. But your track across the ground, because you're being blown, might be 275. So it's telling you you're tracking 5 degrees the wrong way. So whatever you are flying on your actual heading, you need to correct 5 degrees this way. So instead of flying a 270, I should fly a 265. Then that is going to make your track as well as your desired track the same. And that's what we want. So we're actually heading 265, turning into the wind a little bit, making our actual track 270 and our desired track 270, and that's going to keep our needle in the center. So it kind of helps you figure out what heading is going to work to keep you on course. There's no guessing like we do really with the VOR indicator. The GPS is showing us what our ground track is. Now, I've seen a lot of students do this. They think that if my, let me get rid of this. They think that if my direct or desired track was 270 and I'm currently tracking 280, that I simply could take the airplane and just start a left-hand turn until they match. Well, there's a problem with that because your airplane has to receive the satellites, digest the information before it presents it on the screen. So there's a bit of a lag. You can't just turn the airplane and expect that when this reaches 270 that you're on the right heading, because by the time you roll out, this most likely is going to end up at 260 because you went too far. Okay, so again, I warn you, don't, if your track is off from your desired track, don't just turn the airplane to try to make them agree with each other. Think about it logically. How many degrees am I off? And then correct the number of degrees on your heading indicator and then try to fly that heading. Another thing I want to point out about the GPS is that you can zoom in and out, and there's going to be some sort of arrows up and down, in and out. On the KLN 94B, the arrows are here, so I can zoom in on my map or I can zoom back away from it. On this particular one here, there's up at the top right, there's arrow keys, and then also on the touch screen, there's arrows up and down to zoom in and out. Now, another thing I want to mention is I talked about looking at your VOR indicator and don't stare at the map. So if you're using your VOR indicator to see if you're on course or slightly off course, then you need to make sure that the GPS is working with your VOR indicator, because this one can be used with the VOR. It can also be used with the GPS. There's going to be some button in your airplane, or excuse me, some button on the GPS or in the airplane somewhere that allows you to switch from the VOR function to the GPS function. So on this particular one here, in the airplane itself, on the overhead or on the panel itself, is a button where you switch from GPS to VOR. On this particular model here, you would actually push the CDI button and it's going to switch from GPS over to nav. Be careful that you have switched it to the proper selection, because otherwise you may think you're navigating with GPS when you're in effect still navigating on the VOR. Another thing I want to point out is the fact that some of the GPSs include more than just GPS. For example, the Garmin 430 and 530 also are our communication radios. So this is a GPS unit as well as a communication unit. The COM selector is right here, and then your nav selector is right here. Now we can take it a couple steps further with the touchscreen, the Garmin 650, and this one also, not only does it have a COM radio, it tells you to push here to switch it to a nav. It also has a transponder embedded in this equipment as well. So they can be a little confusing until you actually understand how to use them. So let's again look at just a couple of the highlights. There's 24 satellites, 5 in view at all times, 4 required for a 3D picture. The GPS unit needs to be current. Every 28 days it should be updated. We want to make sure that it self-tests properly and that it's acquiring the number of satellites that it needs to identify your position. Then the quick keys are the ones that are very easy to use. We have the direct key, so I can choose from point A to point B. We have a nearest that'll bring up the nearest airport or VOR or NDB or intersection. How we make selections, we use the large knob to move the cursor around, and we use the small knob to actually make the selection. There's usually other selections that are kind of embedded in the screen that we can use, and I like to call them books. So we can select a book by the large knob moving the cursor, and then the small knob will turn through our pages in the book. Then also the flight plan key, we typically use that to make a more elaborate flight plan when it's more than just from point A to point B. And why would we want to use the flight plan key? Maybe we want to use it to fly around some airspace, so maybe we wanted to fly from point A, and maybe there's a restricted area here, restricted 3003, and you want to fly to point B before resuming down to point C. And then also keep in mind the different type of GPSs may also have embedded or may include a comm radio, and as well as possibly a transponder.